All right. Well, welcome everybody who's here to our Top IG Professional Development session. Teachers of Pronunciation are tops. Today we're going to have Chutes and Ladders. Very fun game since we were very small, but this one will be on Adventures in Process-Based Listening Pedagogy. Introducing first of all our co-coordinators, and I'm Marsha Champ. We also have Randy
Randy Reitmeyer.
and
Patrick Mrozek. Hello.
Patrick Mrozek. So if you wouldn't mind, would you like to type into the chat your name, place, and what do you teach, or what kind of students do you teach? And is there something that brings you here in particular to this topic today? Type that in the chat so we get to know who all is here. And as you know, our session today is being presented by William C. Cole French, who we usually just call Will, right? And Will is here to tell us about his research and practicality with teaching listening, which is such an important part of pronunciation. Pronunciation is the output and listening is the input. And you know how well related they are. Well, he's going to tell us more about that. Meanwhile, while you are typing in the chat to introduce yourselves, I'd like to let everybody know that we have several means of communication within our organization, which is CATESOL. CATESOL Top at catesol.org is our message board. So if you are a member of our group, that is how you can easily reach all of the top people in CATESOL. Also, whether you are a member or not, then you have the opportunity to be with us on our Facebook page. If you are a Facebook member, then you can join our Facebook group, which is also here in the chat. In addition, I'd like to show you that we have a Padlet. So our teaching of pronunciation Padlet has a number of things which will, keep you in touch with us. We have the links to our recorded professional development webinars, some of our conference presentations, and then some news, communication, and upcoming events. So those are some of the links that we'd like to share with you at this time. In addition to one more, for both our members and our guests, you can also get onto our email notification newsletter. And this is a tiny URL where you can sign up if you haven't already done so. This will give you an opportunity to receive information about our upcoming webinars. And I know we get a lot of email in all directions on all of our email identities, but this one specifically will tell you about CATESOL Top webinars, and Patrick sends that out to us every month because we try to have a session every month in CATESOL Top. Yep. Okay, so if you are a member, we have lots of benefits for you, and I'd like to let you know that coming soon, we are going to lower our membership from the current $75 to a mere $30. So that is coming soon. And that makes it much easier for all kinds of members to be participants of this great organization that is CATESOL. Now, I'd like to turn it over to William C. Cole French. Tell us a little bit about you, other than the fact that we know each other through PSLLT and some other organizations. Let me give the screen sharing over to him. And go ahead, Will.
All right. Well, I guess it's 12:10 there for you all, so we can say good afternoon to the Californians now. I am here in Boston, and it's 3:10, and so we're well underway with this day. But I am a transplant from California, I guess I should say. I lived in Santa Rosa for high school, which is north of San Francisco, and I my undergraduate work was at UC Santa Cruz. And so I didn't move to Boston until I had graduated, and I've been busy all over the world, really. Well, not really. I lived in Vietnam with my family for about 10 years. So that is a little bit about my geography, and I'm excited to be with you all today. I currently teach at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, and we have there an academic bridge program, or some of you might call it a pathway program. This is um, an inroad for international students who are looking to study in the United States, but still needing to do some language work as they get going. And so they do kind of a 50-50 kind of language skill development content courses. So within that program, I have been specializing in classes related to oral communication, and kind of learning a lot about effective ways to do that. And I'm very happy to share with you a lot of samples of that as we explore together today. I got my master's from Boston University, and one of my mentors is here with us, Dr. Marnie Reed. And I continue to work with her as an adjunct at BU in the master's TESOL program, non-licensure. So that's kept me fresh and thoughtful. I think especially working next to Marnie keeps me fresh and thoughtful, because Marnie is full of incisive and important questions about any number of things related to linguistics and pedagogy. So I certainly, her kind of influence is kind of backgrounded in some of what we'll look at today. So I guess that's a little bit about myself and what I'm doing professionally. So let's dive in. And again, I'm going to just repost my welcome chat, because there is a link to a folder, and in that folder are 4 sample textbook chapters. I promise you I didn't pirate anything here. These were readily available on the web from the publisher, but I just want us to have a sample of some existing materials to do some thinking around today. And so with that, let me get ready to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you now see the graphic for this presentation. So with that, let's begin. So here's my email address, by the way. I like to use mentimeter.com, or for you, it's menti.com. It's an easy way to gather ideas and insights from participants. I use it a lot with my students. And so if you go to menti.com, or here's the link and the code, and you should see a question there. And it's just an opportunity to kind of, for me to get to know you a little bit. How would you explain the difference between, reading and listening? Is depending on your background, you may have kind of thought of them both as receptive skills, but that's not to say they're in any way the same. Okay, so, and this is the kind of resource that we can put up in the collection of slides after the meetings, just so that you can digest all of this. And as I read your thoughtful answers, I begin to think about a way to modify my question And I think I would essentially want you to begin thinking about, if you were talking to your students, what would you want to kind of emphasize for them about the difference between reading and listening? I see a few of you talking about their students, you know, students it's more difficult than reading and writing, not as much experience, they don't understand me. So there's kind of the linguistic description, kind of, auditory input, decoding phonemes. But I think I was hoping, and I think this is built into this, but again, what might students want to consider about the difference between listening and reading? So for example, no white spaces between the words. And or if a reader sees a new word in English, it might be recognizable, but when hearing it, it is often not. So there's a little bit of thinking here about what might trip students up in the realm of listening, which is important. Listening is quicker or more fleeting, whereas with reading, we can take a bit more time to process it. And what does that more time to process it look like for so how do students, I guess, create time to process listening? What have you seen? Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, right? So yes, this is right, that with reading, we have more time to process it. We can kind of pause, we can think about it. But how have you seen students create process time for themselves with listening?
Usually they don't, because it's not easy. You can move your eyes again over the text, but you have to actually ask somebody to repeat, unless you're listening to a recording, and then you can use the rewind button, so to speak. But otherwise, in conversation, that's there's
Yeah,
all
that's
these
an
there's all the other influences like face,
right.
politeness, and
Right. Yeah, you can only ask if you're in a live conversation, you can only ask, can you repeat that so many times? Um, so absolutely that's true. What about, you mentioned also recording. So one thing students might do to give themselves more process time is to say, play it again, or rewind, or skip back. Rebecca, you have an idea?
I was just wanting to clarify the direction of your question. Are you asking in conversation, or when the instructor is in control of hitting play on the recording? How are students creating space for themselves in that situation?
I think for starters, let's just, let's imagine how we're teaching in the classroom. And I'm assuming that many of us teach listening in conjunction with some kind of recording.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm wanting us to think, like, how do students either create process time for themselves or ask us to create process time when they're listening to a recording?
ah, okay. In that case, um, I don't know that students do this, but one of the things that I think is useful is to slow down the input using um, a, a program that I use often for singing. It's called AnyTune. It's a musician's program,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something that allows the learner to listen with a completely same rhythm, tone, no change in any of that, just a slower pace, and then can move it up from, let's say, 80% to 90% to 100. But that's not something common at all, and that's
Yeah.
not something that's in language classrooms.
Marsha, can you write the name of the program in the chat?
I will do that.
Thank you.
Would note-taking allow them to create those kinds of spaces, or is that still too cognitively demanding at the same time?
That is a great question, Rebecca. And my short answer would be note taking has its own set of challenges to it.
Mhm.
And I I don't know that note-taking would be, I don't think students go to note-taking to increase their process time regardless.
Right.
But there's something really obvious that my students do. I'm just waiting to see whether I'm the only one kind of experiencing this. Natalia, do you have something?
Yeah, I would usually give them, for example, if it's like a test, listening test or something like that, in course book, we usually have some kind of questions and the exercise that they will be, so it's kind of pre-listening activities that we will be discussing first. And if they read information, all the information that they have before they listen, they'll be focused on that topic and it will be kind of easier for them. I would say the most difficult part is, for example, some geographical names, if they are not aware about the pronunciation, so they will be kind of stuck there and kind of lost.
Yes.
But if they read it through at the beginning and they kind of have a feeling what it is about, it will be much easier. Thank you.
Right. Well, and right there you hit on something. So there is previewing, right? There's ways that certainly we as instructors can preview some materials, and I would say that has some usefulness from the standpoint that it builds context for the listener, and context is an important thing that we use to understand each other when listening and speaking. But you also mentioned reading, and herein lies kind of, I think, a dilemma with listening is many students and teachers increase process time for listening by resorting to reading and reading the transcript or reading the subtitles. And I think that's important to emphasize, because as soon as we begin doing that, students are stepping out of listening skill development and essentially kind of, they're reading. They're no longer listening. And so the question would be, how do we, are there other options available to us that could help students stay in the process and the discomfort of listening a bit longer? So, all right, but any other, I am monitoring the chat, and I do like to kind of bounce around as we kind of talk through these things. So there is some kind of flexibility for tangents. I'm pretty good at reeling us in, so don't worry. If you're not sure something is off topic, you can kind of throw it in. In regards to the tangent of recording speed, I mean, it's not exactly a tangent, but just to mention YouTube and TED Talks and Youglish. I'm wondering if you all are familiar with youglish.com. I'm putting the link in the chat, but that is a really interesting resource for listening. But all of these web-based sites do have ways to slow themselves down, usually like 0.75 and 0.5 speeds. They also have ways to speed it up. Not so useful probably for our students, but so there are these kind of mechanisms built into some sites to help us. But here are some of my own ideas. You can still see my screen, right? I lose track of these things. So, when this is a slide from what I discussed with my students about some of the differences between listening and reading. And so it relates to how many times we hear things. I mean, many of us, it would be interesting to have a slide, like if you're working with a listening text, how many times do you end up letting your students hear it in class? Is it 1 time, 5 times? That would be an interesting question. Consider it for yourself, because most contexts, if it's a real context, whether it's a lecture or a conversation, you have generally 1 opportunity, maybe 2, but you have to use that second excuse me strategically. You can't use it every other sentence. So with listening, right? I mean, this slide that you see here has all of these lovely spaces, right? But if I begin reading this, try to find the spaces between my word. You cannot see the spaces between words and paragraphs. You can only hear the pauses of punctuation and phrasing. Those nice little blank spaces begin blending together, and that's what we call connected speech. Thank you, Dr. Reed. So this is a real difficulty in listening. And then on top of this, I'm working in an academic environment. In an academic environment, we also add kind of the challenge of vocabulary study, in that both the complexity of grammar and vocabulary increases. The topics are much more removed from the daily life experiences of our students. And so vocabulary study ends up being fairly closely related to listening, or needs to play a fairly strong support role in the listening skill development for our students. I think something that's interesting when we think about connected speech, in connected, another question I might ask you is, what would your students say is more difficult to hear? Would they say content words like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs are difficult to hear? What would they say? And then, or would they say function words,
Or if they know the
conjunctions?
word function, where they would say that, right? All the little words.
Right, exactly. But I think what's interesting is my students at least are very focused on keywords, and they understand the idea of keywords, and they kind of will hear these very technical words and like, how do you spell that? Or how do you say that? And they get very focused on these words, and they're convinced that if they understand these words, that they'll understand what they're hearing, and they don't take these function words, pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, they don't take them very seriously. But it's the pronouns, the conjunctions, the prepositions that are really being compressed when we speak. And that's a lot of what creates this sense of blending in words. So it's an interesting question. And again, in an academic environment, the good news is some of the prevalence of connected speech goes down because language is a bit more formal. But in conversation, right? Rebecca was asking about conversations. In conversations, connected speech goes way up, and that blending that we hear in day-to-day conversation is very common, so this is these are some challenges to it. All right, so let's think. There's also some research about how teachers teach listening, and the sad situation is that many of our approaches are not helping. So there's kind of a strong emphasis on comprehension questions, and listening for the main idea, listening for details, and the researchers who have looked at this essentially feels like the message becomes try harder. Answer this question, you didn't get it, let's listen again. And so this is, I think, perhaps this is even familiar to you. I mean, this has been, I think, fairly well documented by a number of people over the past decade or so. But it's when we begin thinking about a process based pedagogy, the word process here is a really important contrast to the product, to the outcome of listening, which is understanding, right? We do want students to listen and understand, whether it's a lecture or a conversation, but what are the subroutines that will help them do that, and how do we help them kind of practice those subroutines so that they're kind of online and ready to assist, um, and they feel less need to go to reading as a solution. Anyway, I
Excuse
see
me,
a
Will. Do you
yeah,
have time to take a question?
I do.
Okay, so Rebecca had her hand raised. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, is that okay if I ask or
Yeah.
jump in just with maybe more of a comment than a question? I just keep nodding and nodding as you're talking because I'm, one of the struggles that we face is the idea that in order for students to demonstrate that they have heard something, that demonstration often the default is comprehension questions. And then when you play the audio as instructors, sometimes you just hope for some divine intervention, that they'll get it, and that if they don't get it, you'll just play it again, and if they don't get it, then you play it again. And if they fail the exam, then well, that means that they're not ready for the next level. And but what that fails to recognize is what are those pieces that
Right.
actually teach the skill of listening. And I think when we look at the productive skill of speaking, and we look at how do we teach students how to engage in the skill of speaking, we look at connective language, and we look at pronunciation, and there are all sorts of strategies to be able to allow students to become better speakers. But how do you get into somebody's head to make them a better listener? And I find that listening is such an under-researched area, especially academic listening. And I'm wondering if you find that finding resources to help support teaching and learning in academic listening is hard to do, or if you found a landmine of stuff, because I'm constantly looking for research on listening pedagogy for academic listening.
Well, I mean, I appreciate knowing that there's some resonance for you on this, Rebecca, and I think that's important. And I think, again, this is well attested to in the research that's been done. I guess for the second part of your question, hopefully you'll find some nuggets today as we explore. And you can kind of evaluate whether they're gold, silver, or bronze, or copper. I don't know what comes after bronze, but you can kind of evaluate whether they're kind of useful resources. But if nothing else, I hope they're a model of what it looks like to try and get students moving towards process themselves, right? A part of the implication of process-based pedagogy is that the means are as important as the ends, and so we want students to kind of become familiar with the tools along the way that they can use to cope with the difficulties. It's difficult to remove all challenges for listening. So far today, my dogs have been cooperating. I live in a house with 2 dogs, 2 cats, and one particularly squawky bird. And so far today, they've been very cooperative. But if they get noisy, or if someone rings the doorbell while we're meeting today, I'm gonna, lose focus in speaking. And if you're asking a question, it'll be hard to hear you. But I still will probably be able to piece together what you're asking about using a bunch of subroutines, and that's part of what we're looking for. Is we're not trying to promise to students that we can take listening and somehow make it magically easier, but what we can give them are some tools and some techniques that they can use to leverage to kind of overcome the hurdles that are built into most listening experiences. So, but Rebecca, again, my program and my experience in Vietnam was very much required a lot of material development, right? I needed to be able to create my own materials. And so I almost never, so I do not have some secret treasure trove from some publisher or some corner of the web to offer a bunch of resources. But I've been trying to use some of the principles that we find in research to see how I can, create my own resources for students, and then pair them with things like TED Talks and other such things. So, but let's. Our theme is Chutes and Ladders, and so just again, drawing from the research, like these are some of the specific difficulties that language learners face when listening. They have difficulty segmenting words because they're blending together. They have difficulty recognizing communicative intent, and frequently that's related to intonation, and pace and pitch. I mean, they have difficulty with vocabulary. We've talked about that, and so these are some realms of difficulty, and so if these are the chutes, these are the things that if students kind of hit, they're going to kind of go sliding down, pull the emergency brake, grab the transcript. What are the ladders that we could build for our students so that they can kind of face a difficulty and begin climbing back up? So what I'd like to do at this point, I'll put the next question up on Mentimeter. And some of you have already begun answering it. But again, in the chat, I gave you that link, and in that link, there's 4 different sample chapters. What I'm going to attempt to do now, brace yourselves, because this could be a chute in and of it. I intend it to be a ladder, but if
can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that people know what chutes and ladders refers to. Now,
good point.
Okay, so for those of you who didn't grow up here in this country or in this state, Chutes and Ladders is a child's game where basically you roll a dice and you go that number of steps on a square, and you either land on a place where it's a ladder and you get to climb up higher to a more closer to the final spot, the winning spot, or you may end up on a tile or a square that makes you fall down and go to another place. Okay, well, I'm glad I'm hearing this, because I think, Willie, you've got this in your mind about chutes and ladders, and I thought it was really a cool sort of thing too, but I thought it would be really good to make sure the understanding is there. Why did you call this chutes and ladders? Because what we think is that many times our students, in trying to understand what is supposed to go into their ear and then into their brain, they missing and they fall down the chute and they get lost. Isn't that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes.
Whereas we, as a practitioners, as teachers, as experts in pronunciation, want to be able to give them the scaffolding, the ladders that allow them to go like toward the goal. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. I'll pay you later. That's really, I think, a good emphasis on it. And I mean, the thing, I'm glad you just kind of, I am dating myself a little bit here by referencing this game, because I would guess that even my children, I have 3, I would guess that they don't know this game themselves, right? But back when I was their age, this was a game that we played. If you are struggling to understand the metaphor of this, I just will take the moment to say this is a problem of context while listening. I'm using kind of a contextual reference to a game, and I'm assuming Marsha has some familiar with the game. Dr. Reed has some familiarity with the game. But if you don't have a familiarity with the game, this becomes much more difficult for you to understand. And this comes out a lot in something like TED Talks, where speakers will refer to things that students have no experiences with. This past year, I was using a TED Talk by a medical professional named Atul Gawande. And the title of the
Very
talk,
important speaker.
right, the title of the talk was "How Do We Heal Medicine?" And he was contrasting the Lone Ranger with pit crews. And again, these are things, pit crews, well, I'll explain pit crews in a minute, but, Lone Rangers, very kind of, historic icon of American television. Pit crews relate to Formula One racing. Well, my student from Vietnam had no context for pit crews, and so she thought that he was talking about the people who get down in the dirt to dig the foundation of a house. That was her best guess about what he was talking about, because she had no context for what a pit crew could be. And so that had a dramatic influence on her ability to understand the ideas in the talk. And it's a great illustration on how, when we don't have a shared context, whether it's Chutes and Ladders or the Lone Ranger or pit crews or baseball, we'll have significant difficulties in listening that won't even be resolved by reading the transcript. We'll read the transcript and we still won't understand what we're seeing. So anyway, thank you for that, Claire, or just point of emphasis. But again, what I'd like to attempt to do here is to kind of get us into some breakout rooms. I want us to look at these chapters to just kind of think about what's missing and what could be added to help students take more control over the
Okay.
process of
This
listening.
relates to what I asked you to do about taking some sort of lessons that are published that teachers get,
Right.
and then they're supposed to do a listening thing, and then we know that's not really teaching them listening. What would we do
Right.
to make it better? Is that the
Yeah,
same thing?
yeah.
Okay. Why don't we start out with 7 minutes?
In the chat, I had put a link to some materials, and you're just going to open up one of those materials and think about, what's what do you notice about the listening and vocabulary activities, and what's missing from these that might really could do more to equip students. All right, so here we go. Okay, welcome back. And are there any key themes that emerged as you talked together about things that might be missing from these listening activities? Things that could help students build a process of.
Yeah, we talked about how the books, and I'm familiar with the 21st Century Communication series.
We looked at in our group. We looked at the fourth sample.
Okay.
Right, and then we noticed that they did bring in some listening skills, but they were all top-down listening skills of activating prior knowledge and previewing, and then they didn't. There was nothing, in fact, in the realm of helping the students develop their bottom-up listening skills.
Good. That's an important concern. Someone else. Let's keep going.
We looked at the same chapter, and the two sections in the bottom that talked about those speaking skills. One was very discrete. So it was looking at elision and connected speech. And our question or discussion focused on you know, how do we use that little box and exploit that to support listening for students in ways that isn't overwhelmingly kill and drill? And then is there value to replaying and replaying and replaying and replaying over and over and over again and really analyzing, you know, that kind of connected speech? Is that time well spent in moving to larger lengths of listening? Because I was saying that we typically have students listening for 3 to 5 minutes at our lower levels and 8 to 10 minutes at our higher levels. You know, but if you're doing something as discrete as those points that are listed in that textbook, then you know, how do they apply that in a larger context?
Right. Yeah.
And then the opposite that is the macro skill of a speaking skill to state your position. So one of them has to do with just the very discrete skills of looking at pronunciation in terms of listening. And the other one is more of, okay, well, now that you've heard something, how do you communicate what you've heard? And so that's a much different task than actually learning to listen.
Yes. There's a lot of good kind of areas of potential leverage in there, and some good teaching is perhaps teaching topics as well. Others? Well, just in the interest of time, let's keep let me kind of pull out a few things in this. So one is in the group I was with, we were talking about connected speech as well, and I think it's important to remember that connected speech does occur, but it doesn't always occur. And so I don't know that it's necessarily I mean, it could be difficult to go hunting for it in some of these materials, but there's always a value in kind of teaching it proactively as a category and demonstrating it. The phrase I learned connected speech on is "tell her I'll meet her," and I like to kind of use that phrase with my students. I say, I have a normal sentence for you. Here's a phrase, you know, and listen once, tell her I'll meet her. How many words? And they will say one word, thermometer, or they'll say something about a bank teller. So I think there's a real valuable place for teaching connected speech as a category for students, and then teaching the principles of it. And I'm using kind of 3 basic principles. Words are contracted, sounds are deleted, consonants are linked to vowels. And then what you could do, even with a text like 21st century communication, is say, okay, if the speaker does use connected speech, what would it sound like? We don't know, but we have this fine sentence of vocabulary here. My group was looking at livable city, and the first vocabulary sentence is San Francisco is an attractive city. And again, if that's spoken with connected speech, where will there be linking? Will there be deletion? There's no deletion necessarily, but it's not going to be is an attractive city. It'll be is an attractive city. And so there's some value for students in learning to predict what it would sound like, because that begins to acclimate them to the fact that, you know, what they're used to reading is not necessarily going to sound so clean and polished when they're listening. So that's I think a significant thing to kind of pre-teach and then return to with something like the sentences we see with vocabulary in 21st century communication skills. So let me just kind of highlight a few potential process things that are missing from what we are looking at together. So and I'm going to just kind of pull from resources I developed. Hopefully I just shared the right screen. Do you see vocabulary? It's just 1, 2, yeah, I'm sharing the right screen. So this is a journal I developed for my students to complete with words from TED Talks. And again, think about how different this is from what we just saw in the textbook. In the textbook, they're listening for words and they're finding definitions. They weren't asked to think about word form very explicitly. They were not asked to think about word stress at all. Is attractive 3-2, stress on the second syllable, attractive, or is it attractive, or is it attractive? That's pretty important for how their ability to kind of actually recognize the words. At my university, a lot of the international students talk about anatomy. You know what that is, right? Anatomy and physiology. But you know, they don't recognize the word anatomy. They know the word anatomy. So when we think of it, so what's interesting to me about the vocabulary study in this book is that there's all of these missed opportunities to help students think explicitly about word stress and even to think about word form. You know, attractive is a verb, is an adjective. What's the verb? What's the noun? What's the benefit of considering a word family in addition to just, you know, over say just one word? And inviting students to consider that is inviting them into a process of learning that has the potential to multiply. Another really interesting thing is for nearly every textbook I see is that the authors choose the words. What do you think? Would there be benefit for letting students choose the words themselves? I like to give my students a word cloud for something we're listening to. And I like to then use LexTutor to create an inventory of the word. And the numbers here refer to the number of times a word is used. And I like to teach them the principle that if a word is used a lot, maybe it's an important word to know. And here are kind of the more rare words. But again, within the TED Talk, you know, hippocampus is used 10 times. That seems important. They probably need to know what hippocampus is, even though it's maybe not your everyday sort of word. But I very rarely see textbooks inviting students to choose words to study. They're almost always pre-chosen. And I just think it's a simple example of the way in which students are not being invited into a process. And that there's a decision-making opportunity for them around something as simple as vocabulary in terms of what words will you study. And that would be one example of a process that I can share with you. So let's think. And I heard us also kind of acknowledge that this textbook is kind of, as we often see, thinking about main ideas and details. And certainly main ideas and details are important. I'm hoping that you'll hold on to the main idea of process-based pedagogy as we meet today. But when we think about listening, again, we're trying to identify the subroutines that could help students get to that point of recognizing the main ideas and the details. Rebecca, I see your hand. Do you have a question or a thought?
Yeah, sorry. When you give the students the choice to choose the vocabulary words, do you have a sense of what kinds of words they select? Do they generally choose words that are common on the academic word list or general service lists?
So I don't, that's a great question. I don't give them the general service list. You know, I kind of start with the AWL, and then I give them, essentially, if you use LexTutor, I give them the yellow words and the red words. Um, so, but, and generally speaking, they do seem to end up choosing similar words. I would say the majority of them, the majority of my students are choosing words from the AWL, the yellow words, if you know, again, from LexTutor. But they do tend to choose a few words from this, the red words, the rare words. But again, I'm trying to teach them, you know, like, look at the word cloud, and that size represents frequency. And so if you don't, you know, and we can see here that the word hippocampus, you know, is fairly noticeable. And so we can predict it's going to be important, and there could be some benefit in studying it and studying the pronunciation of it. So I do see them, I haven't like crunched the numbers, just because I do review every vocabulary journal for each TED Talk, but you know, it would be another step for me to try to capture what are they choosing, and are there patterns to what they're choosing. But that's I guess what I can tell you, kind of off the top
Great, thank you.
of my head. And then anyway, let me show you another, when we let me think about, so I mentioned, for example, you know, that word stress might be something important to include for study. It's also another thing to include perhaps for, it's an alternate to say the comprehension check is, can they hear a word and recognize the stress count of it? This particular student obviously has difficulties. The good news is that he's improved. But, you know, I will use, this student is not having those kinds of struggles, but these are keywords from the TED Talk. They've listened to the TED Talk. Now what we're going to do is to hear 5 different speakers say the same word using Youglish, and their job is just to figure out what is the stress count. Again, this in essence is a test, if you will, but the test is designed to kind of focus them on the importance of sound and not ignoring the kind of information that's embedded in sound, and to kind of build that association between words and stress and word form. And so this is kind of training them. These pieces of information are important for your listening. So, and so that would be another thing that you could do. I mean, if you're using a textbook like 21st Century Communication, this should be pretty easy. You know, don't just have them listen to the speaker from 21st Century Communication say in Attractive City. You know, have them listen to 5 people on Youglish use the word attractive, and see what it sounds like. And you know, and my students become proficient in, you know, what I call this kind of XY formula that I use. And by the way, I know there's also YX. I mean, there's lots of ways in which this gets represented in the literature, but my students become, you know, I can begin to correct them. If they say the word incorrectly, I can say not 4-3, 4-2, and then they can correct themselves. And so this is a tool that becomes useful not just for listening, but also for pronunciation. So that's, I think, an important part of the process for them. Let's see. On the topic of listening and processing sound, right? This is another thing that you could consider doing, right? We know that pausing and intonation and pace are all important to the message of what's being spoken. Have you ever asked your students to document where they hear pauses occurring? Have you asked them to document intonation?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you haven't, you could be saying to them unimportantly, this stuff doesn't matter, just the main ideas matter, just the words matter. But when we invite them to kind of listen for pausing or for emphasis in intonation, we're highlighting for them this information is important. And it's a very different kind of question than, what was the main idea of this presentation. Now, what's interesting is the intonation actually is supporting the main idea, right? It's part of how we know someone is really trying to focus on something, is that sound tells us this is what I care about. But if we never kind of help students kind of practice recognizing the sound, they're just relying upon the words and the context. So this is, and again, I just have a few student samples here. And they become very good at hearing pausing. We work on pausing from the early on in the semester. And then in the second half of the semester, we build in kind of specialized stress. This again invites students. And I was thinking as I was preparing for this is that, what you don't see when you look at a paper like this is that you don't hear me reminding students. It's like, okay, so now we're going to listen for intonation. And remember, intonation is an important part of the message of a speaker. And it's not the kind of thing we want to kind of ignore. And so try to annotate which words are being especially emphasized by the speaker. And this is where I use like that 0.75 setting that's available on TED Talks. I don't tell them, quite honestly, but I just kind of slow it down so they just have a little bit more process time to kind of think about what they're hearing. Good. I'm just double checking chats for Alex. Okay, so by the way, Alex says thanks for that question. So my favorite word cloud site comes out of Stanford, and it's called wordsift.org. And it'll take a text and make a word cloud out of it. And if you wanted some pointers on how to use it, I'd be happy to kind of send a few instructions by email. Just follow up with me. But yeah, there's a lot of tools for word cloud out there. I just use WordSift. And so as long as you can copy and paste the full text, it'll do the calculations on what's the most frequent word. So let me show you two other process-based tools that I'm using. And one of them is called what I call the problem-solving worksheet. And so I invite my students to think about areas that are causing problems for them while they're listening. And so I ask them to describe kind of the area of difficulty. And then you see how I say here, sound, language, and context. These are kind of the three resources that we use when we listen to understand what we're hearing. And I've walked through I have kind of mini lectures on each of these things and on how we use each of these things to help ourselves as we listen. And so I'm inviting them to try to think now, is this a difficulty of sound? Is this a difficulty of language? Um, is this a difficulty of context? And so I don't know that we see a very effective problem solving process on this particular student's page, but this is kind of feedback for you or for me about what they're able to make sense of. And it gives me insight on how I might kind of support them. Let's just see, so for example, when um, you know, these salute try to draw the different conclusions of cases. So, I mean, that's very similar to try harder. And then the student says, I'm just listening more times and pausing. So this clearly struggling to kind of have kind of some effective, let's see, I feel like I have more than, oh no, I guess this is just one example of it. So, um, so yeah, over the course of a semester, I do see students kind of make progress, right? So even this is a process-based resource, and that students kind of, begin the semester with their sense of possible strategies, but I can give them feedback. It's like, okay, this is a good problem. Here's an alternate strategy. And so we're interacting more about how to work with the listening text. A final process-based resource that I use, and this relates more to discourse elements and pronunciation elements. I always ask my students when they listen to something to think about one or two moments that seem particularly strange, creative, or unexpected. And what's interesting is this is a particular TED Talk, and what I noticed in looking at it is, this student is thinking about the writer or the speaker is using complicated nouns to make it more professional. And he has some opinions about it. Not everyone is talented in English. And I think it's more important to use straightforward words rather than difficult words. And so it's actually quite thoughtful. Like the student is thinking deeply about how the speaker is using words. But what I found interesting, and this was useful in the context of the class, is a different classmate called the same words colorful. And he thought that it was actually quite valuable for engaging the listener. And he's thinking about ways that he might work to become better himself at using different words to get the listener's attention, as he says. So what's the point here? The point is that there's process-oriented questions beyond what's the main idea, what are the supporting details that you can be asking your students to consider in response to something they're hearing. And that just by asking questions like that, you're inviting them to consider the ways different parts and pieces are working together as we listen. The other, I guess for me, the other part of it is that there's so many potential learning opportunities within a listening text. I'm trying to kind of create a divergent question structure that allows students to kind of contribute out of what was significant to them, right? When we ask students what was the main idea, generally speaking, there are right answers and wrong answers. And that's part of what I'm even may fuel this sense of, well, let's listen again to get the right answer. But if we ask them a more general question of what did you notice about the way the speaker used words, or what did you notice about the way the speaker used sound, you're inviting them to kind of go into an analysis mode around the way language is working. So anyway, I found it to be, I picked some of my most recent examples of this. And I've been using kind of some of these tools for 3 or 4 years now, and it's generally, fairly delightful to kind of read them and to see what students are picking up on. And I have a better sense of how students are processing the language that they're hearing, which then helps me to kind of, shift the focus of my own teaching to kind of match where they're at. I hope that makes some sense. So, very good. How are we doing on time, Marsha?
Great. Will, thanks you so much. You've given us a lot of background on things that we could do in the classroom to promote the process of listening skills, and shown us how we can actually create. And I think that's something we as practitioners need to do, is whatever group of learners we are with, we can't expect a textbook to do the thing. The textbook is a springboard. It is merely a springboard. And I think all teachers should know that. And that what we always need to know is our target. Who are we teaching? What do they need to know? What do they need to learn? And how will they get there? And we're the expert teachers who put this all together. So you've given us a lot of ideas about how we can involve our listeners, our learners, in the whole process of learning. And that's really something that textbooks can't do. They can give you questions, think about this or discuss this with a partner. And some of those, in the textbooks that give these kinds of pre-listening activities, they're very useful, but they're usually based on content, like that's something that will get us to the right answer, and not things that you brought up here about what are the things that are impeding us as listeners, and what are the things that we can do to climb that ladder in the ladder, right? And not fall down the chute, and instead walk up and get that scaffolding to bring us forward. Showing the examples that you use with your students is helpful as well. And I think they work particularly well in your situation where you have a highly academic group of students. Yeah. So that's very useful in those cases. But there are a lot of these things that we can do with beginner or intermediate level students. I'm just going to say, for example, the books that I wrote on English for childcare and English for child development, they all have how to do listening things, like listen for the syllable stress code of words. And, that's one of the things that you brought up. And those are the things that we help them do in order to get to the problem of, well, what is somebody need? What do they, how do we want to interact with them? So I appreciate very much how you've explained and demonstrated and given us a chance to interact. And I also want to thank Marnie very much. Some of you who had not been with us in our top group before, please take a look at the Padlet, because it will give you links to the previous webinars, including Marnie's on listening. What was the title of yours, Marnie? It was Lessons Learned from SLIFE or something like that, right?
Lessons from SLIFE, yes.
And also, let's give Marnie props for two things. One is for suggesting that Will be one of our speakers, and another for the publication of a book that I think would be interesting to us. So go ahead.
Thank you, Marsha. So I wanted to mention that Will has a chapter in a book that Tamara Jones, many of you would know Tamara Jones, she's now on the TESOL board. Tamara edited a book called Pronunciation in the Classroom, and she and I edited Listening in the Classroom. And Will has a chapter, and the chapter is called, Did You Hear That? Note-taking in the English for Academic Purposes Classroom. So it is a chapter on note-taking and how to do note-taking effectively. So actually being able to process what you hear, as opposed to assuming that students can process what they heard and they just need to learn how to organize it. This is a very thoughtful chapter in listening, and this is a TESOL Press publication. Thank you, Marsha.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the participants for being participants and participating in our discussion, both in the larger group and in our small groups. I'd like to let you know that we're going to have a session using Chat GPT. Wow. Wow.
Watch
Can
out.
we use it in the act of teaching pronunciation? So mark your calendars for May 26th, or get on our mailing list so that you'll get a notification of the whole details and how to register for it. Thank you all once again. To our wonderful presenter, applause.
Very nice to be with you all. It's always a privilege to kind of interact with people and to learn more about kind of the specifics of what's happening around the country. So thank you for having me.